Kia koutou kia ora. I'm happy to take the call on this important issue and mostly common sense bill. This is the first piece of legislation I've seen through the House, and while my colleagues would agree it's probably not the most glamorous bill, it is an important one. Before I touch on the specific parts of the bill, I'd like to discuss the role of infrastructure in general. Infrastructure is an important part of economic, social and environmental development. And good planning can see positive outcomes, whereas bad planning and infrastructure can see us slip down a path of diminishing prosperity, negative social outcomes and declining environmental health. The government earlier this month, with the launch of their $18 billion over 10-year infrastructure plan, announced 5 priorities: broadband, electricity, regulatory reform, roads of national significance and the Rugby World Cup 2011. The Greens believe these are important areas to focus on. However, on each point, we strongly differ on the path the government has gone down. Just looking at one in particular, the roads of national significance, or as I call it, the road to no sustainability, in the plan they include a future spend of $9.6 billion on only 7 roads and a further $13.5 billion on other roading projects. That's a huge part of our national wealth. For rail, however, there's no new spending. This government is putting all of our bets on roads. Many of the 7 roads of national significance are very poor economic decisions. For example, the $2 billion Puhoi to Wellsford Holiday Highway has a benefit-cost ratio of only 0.8, whereas the Transmission Gully White Elephant Motorway has a BCR of only 0.6. These roads of national significant gambles are politically driven rather than based on sound economic analysis. They will lock us into a high-carbon future, doing nothing to help our climate change effort, nothing to assist with our valuable clean and green brand, and act as expensive millstones around our necks as the price of oil inexorably rises. Why would this government place all our bets on roads as a measure to reduce congestion when all the local international experience shows it just doesn't work? In the last budget, for every $1 spent on sustainable modes of transport, buses, trains, walking and cycling, National will spend $7 on roads. It's simple economic mismanagement. The Greens would spend money on roads for sure, but roads are actually not the priority in the short to medium term. We'd favour a more balanced investment approach, especially in places like Auckland, where the economic costs of congestion are stifling. 16% of Auckland's wealth is spent on transport, compared with 6% in Europe and other Asian cities with a more balanced investment approach to mobility. If you look at the actual investment this government is planning for transport infrastructure, it's not an exaggeration to say this government is hysterically pro-roads. The Greens plan to give Kiwis choice about how they'll get to work, not sentence them to greater levels of automobile dependence. Our recommendation for transport in our Green New Deal package is fiscally neutral. In the short term, we would shift $1 billion of state highway funding into more sustainable, more productive, higher quality alternatives, taking the pressure off our alternative roads. Our measures would create 40% more jobs while at the same time making our transportation network more resilient to the inevitable oil price shocks. This is a real jobs package. That's what a Green New Deal looks like, delivering a smart road to prosperity. Even as the government is doing very little to tackle climate change, at least in the infrastructure plan, they touch on this to a small degree. Now looking at the bill in particular in front of us. The Greens voted for this bill in the first reading on the whole because it's simple common sense. As Jeanette Fitzsimon said at the first reading, there is a huge amount of waste when there is no coordination, no planning in terms of combining the wires, pipes and fibre in the same corridor. It's high time to attempt to bring about that kind of rationalisation. Like the TV show game My Son Loves, in this bill, however, one of these parts is not like the other. Parts 1 to 3 naturally go together. Part 1 creates the framework for a consistent national code for access by utility operators to transport corridors. Part 2 harmonises the notice provisions across all the acts and requires territorial local authorities to pay for any amenity improvements when utilities are moved or upgraded. Part 3 cleans up the Railways Corporations Act and harmonises its management provisions with other state-owned enterprises legislation. Part 4 is the odd one out and is not like the others. Like the proverbial square peg in a round hole, we can support the first 3 parts without too much reserve. They are sensible moves. I'd place a wager, however, that if I have the privilege of being re-elected another couple of times, I may see part 2 in this House before I retire, because the balance of costs I strongly suspect is wrong. Part 2 disallows any amenity improvement requirements when work is undertaken unless they are already outlined in the TLA's long-term community council plan, and all costs must be borne by the local authority. This is in contrast to the current law, which splits the amenity improvement costs evenly unless otherwise agreed. Now, looking at the odd one out, Part 4, repealing the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act 2008, the Green Party thinks it's a good move to separate this out into its own mill, avoiding the accusation this government could previously have been labelled with as a cowardly move to hide the sneakily significant repeal of affordable housing provisions. This part should stand alone as its own bill. This is the part, as referred in the minority report by the Labour and Green parties, where we believe it should have been referred to either the Social Services or Local Government and Environment Committees. Housing affordability is a major issue in New Zealand, with close to 1 in 3 New Zealanders now spending 30% or more of their disposable income on housing, with 30% being the internationally agreed benchmark for housing affordability. Demography's 2009 International Housing Affordability Survey found that the median house price in New Zealand is 5.7 times the median household income, ranking New Zealand in the category of severely unaffordable, with only Australia worse at 0.6. But on the bright side, I guess we're catching up with Australia in one respect, boys? It's especially pertinent for people of my generation, people like me who come out of university riddled with encumbered by debt, entering a housing market that's grown rapidly over the last decade, mostly to the benefit of baby boomers and those already on the property ladder, not slowed by sensible moves such as a capital gains tax or revisiting the tax rules around loss attributing qualifying companies. LAQCs allow people to offset their losses in investment properties against personal tax income. This means that young people trying to get into the housing market are effectively subsidising the tax offsets of those buying investment properties using LAQCs. This is wrong and pernicious. Looking at housing affordability in the context of infrastructure, we need to be doing more increasing densities in urban centres around transport corridors rather than adding more urban sprawl. While the Greens supported the Affordable Housing Act through the last Parliament, our support for it was lukewarm because we didn't think it would be particularly effective in achieving its stated objective of making housing more affordable. As it turned out, no territorial local authority made use of the enabling provisions in that Act, so it's not terribly disappointing to see the bulk of the bill repealed. However, the Greens strongly support the part of the Act which prohibited restrictive covenants that aim to exclude social and affordable housing. We are disappointed that the government has decided to water down these provisions and to remove the prohibition of restrictive covenants that aim to exclude affordable housing. As Moana Maki pointed out, the fact is, I think it was relying more on the recession to see house prices drop so significantly that the issue of affordable housing would go off the boil. The fact is that the housing prices have not dropped. Working families are still locked out of the housing market. Mr. Speaker, we are facing a housing crisis. 10,000 people wait on state home rentals. People are forced further and further out of the city and town centres to afford a home, meanwhile spending considerably more of their pay packet on transport. And the homelessness survey, expected to come out in June, I predict, based on Australian estimates and similarities, will see tens of thousands of Kiwis classed as homeless. Mr. Speaker, we support the parts 1 to 3. We believe there's a common sense, but we have grave concerns about part 4. Kia ora.